song, The Rightful Place. So if everybody wants to stand up and kind of sing along, and we'll start with our theme song. As we start our session today, I just wanted to play like a 30-second little video here, just of some of the things going on in our diocese, Eucharistic adoration, and kind of people really encountering Christ. And this is just kind of a little promo for what they're doing with that new initiative called Ignite. soup. I think we have an abundance of soup today, so help yourself to as much soup as you would like. And I got to speak yesterday for a little bit in front of the bishop, which was really cool. I got to meet Bishop Thomas, and wow, what a great guy. Like, he is like a picture of the joy of the gospel. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to hear him or to meet him yet, but just a joy-filled guy, full of zeal, very excited about our new bishop who we have. And he talked about three things yesterday, which I'm sure he's been talking about everywhere, what we need in our diocese. He talked about the rosary, he talked about almsgiving, and he talked about fasting as a means to igniting our diocese. And so I like that little video because it talks about at the end to take a chance, to give God everything. And that's what the joy of the gospel that we've been talking about is about. It's about that missionary joy. It's about living the joy of the gospel so that we can spread that joy and spread our faith by the way we live and by the people that we encounter in our lives. So we're on session 3 of the joy of the gospel. It's actually chapter 2 of the gospel. There was an introduction, and then we did chapter 1 last month. This month is titled Amid the Crisis of Communal Commitment, which is kind of a long phrase for we got to take a look at our problems. You know, if you read my book, The 5 Steps to Winning the War Within, this is kind of like chapter 2, like know your enemy, know what you're up against, and really taking an honest look. I think if we could sum up this chapter, it's with this quote right here. We need to distinguish clearly what might be fruit of the kingdom from what runs counter to God's plan. And so Pope Francis isn't really like, this is right, this is wrong, we need to do this. He's just really throwing out suggestions of what we're up against, and he's looking for answers from everybody. He wants to hear from everybody. How can we face the different crises that we face in our culture? How can we face the different challenges we have as a church and bringing people back to the church and making the church more attractive and making people more excited about their faith and being filled with that joy and the love of Christ. So this is really it's been kind of an examination of conscience for me to read this chapter. And it's really broken up into 2 parts. The first part, he talks about how we're supposed to treat the poor, how we're supposed to treat those who are excluded, the outcast in our society, and how we need to remember our social justice as a church and what we're designed for and what we're built on. A couple of the things he talks about here. One, no to an economy of exclusion. He says, how can it be that it is not a news item when an elderly homeless person dies of exposure, but it is news when the stock market loses 2 points? Almost without being aware of it, we end up being incapable of feeling compassion at the outcry of the poor, weeping for other people's pain and feeling a need to help them, as though all this were someone else's responsibility and not our own. The culture of prosperity deadens us. And he actually points out, it's actually more dangerous in a culture such as ours, where we are surrounded by prosperity. And we easily toss aside those who are outcast, those who have been excluded, and we turn a blind eye, and we even have trouble feeling compassion for that because we just don't even see it anymore. We just turn a blind eye to it, especially in a richer culture like ours. And so Pope Francis is really kind of trying to bring us back to, every human being is made in the image and likeness of God. And we are all brothers and sisters. And we should want to go out and share the joy of the gospel with everybody. We should go out and we should want to help those that we see that are in need. And so we got to say no to this culture of exclusion. And a lot of that is driven by, how do we perceive other people? And I talked about this last time, but if we could view it through God's eyes, that every one of us is a child of God. And you think about your own children, and if your child has a need, you're going to want to fill that need. Especially, when they're that little and cute, we can't see every human person, but if we have that challenge to do that and to see that in every human being that we encounter, in the face of your own child, and how much you would want to help that child if you see them on the street and they're poor, they're hungry, and they need something, our hearts should melt for that. We should feel a deep, deep sense of compassion for those around us. And so that's kind of helped me as an image, and it's funny, as I've read this, how I've been given opportunities to do that. We're going to talk a little bit about this culture of encounter that he wants, that we can't just send money or do whatever. We're distant from that. We actually actually have to encounter these people. And in the last 2 weeks, I've had a couple opportunities, that it's almost like, I've read this and God's like, all right, let's try it now. Let's see how it works. I went to Kansas for a weekend for a Dynamic Catholic event. I was just out in the parking lot, and a homeless lady came up to me and asked me for something. And, I remember what Pope Francis says, you got to encounter them. If you didn't actually touch them, if you didn't actually converse with them, then you didn't really encounter them, even if you gave them money. And so, her name was Linda. I asked her name and shook her hand, and you feel more of a sense of communion with that person. Same thing happened this week. I was in Orlando, which it was 87 degrees and sunny down there, by the way. And same thing, I was in the parking lot, and somebody else came up to me, and the guy's name was Arnie, and he said a Vietnam vet, and he kind of started telling me his life story and all the problems that he'd been through and how he felt like he'd been, pushed aside and excluded, and, who knows what they did with whatever I gave them, but at least I encountered them, at least I asked them their name, and I think sometimes people, they're almost taken aback by that. Some of these people, they haven't even said their own name in, weeks, and nobody's ever asked them their name or their story. And I think that encounter with them is worth more than anything you can actually give them. And so we're often tempted and say, well, I have a child that I support overseas, and I do this and I do that, and we do that, and sometimes we just totally forget about that. We receive letters from our sponsored child, and I ask myself, when was the last time we actually wrote something back or corresponded? It's easy to just put it on auto pay and forget about it. But Pope Francis is talking about something different here. He's talking about encountering other human beings in the world around us. He says no to the idolatry of money. And you think of the golden calf and the Israelites coming out of slavery in Egypt. And in that story, I think the thing to remember is that they've been in slaves for over 400 years. And the challenge that God has is not so much getting them out of Egypt, it's getting Egypt out of them. They're so used to being slaves in this culture where they worship so many false gods that they've started worshiping false gods. That's where the golden calf came from. They wanted a god, they wanted that false god to worship, and they built a golden calf, and they had trouble getting these gods out of their hearts. And sometimes, we have idols ourselves, and money is one of those things where, whether we realize it or not, it becomes an idol in our life sometimes, especially in a culture of prosperity where he talks a lot about individualism. That question where a lot of those deadly sins are driven from, pride, envy, anger, greed. They all ask the same question: what's in this for me? And we start hoarding things, we start being possessive of things, and the more we have to lose, and the more we're worried, and the more stress we have. I think some of the people in the cultures and countries where they don't have as much, a lot of times they're happier because they don't have so much to lose, and their life is more simple, and they know who they are, and they're grateful for everything that they have. And sometimes we forget about that, and money can become an idol. And money, it makes a wonderful servant, but a horrible master. And as soon as we start idolizing money, it can consume us. And so he's saying, no, as long as that money is your idol, you're not going to be able to help the poor, you're not going to be able to share what you have, you're not going to be able to let go of those things that you worship. And so we have to ask ourselves, what do you worship? Because we all worship something. And that's one of the geniuses of Catholicism. That's why, we should go to Mass every Sunday, not because it's a rule or a regulation, but because we actually have a need to worship God. And if we don't come worship God, we're going to worship something else. And people are worshiping a lot of different things out there, whether it's their favorite sports athlete or movie star or money or possessions or toys or gadgets or whatever. We have a need to worship something. Elvis is not the king. God is the king. Right? LeBron James isn't the king either. God is king, and we need to worship the king. No to a financial system which rules rather than serves. And this is what I was just talking about, that money is not meant to rule over us, and we're not meant to use it to rule, we're meant to use it to serve. Your money's not yours. There's nothing wrong with money. It's a beautiful thing, a wonderful thing. But as soon as we get in that possessive mind of it's mine, I earned it, this is mine. Well, where'd you get the ability to earn it? Where'd you get the opportunity to earn it? Where'd you get the life that you have? It all belongs to God. We say we should tithe. Yeah, well, that's giving 10%, but really it's all 100% 100% belongs to God. It's just our decision of how we can use that money to serve other people. You know, it says, St. John Chrysostom said, not to share one's wealth with the poor is to steal from them and to take away their livelihood. It is not our own goods which we hold, but theirs. And so to remember that perspective, Pope Francis is trying to get us back to that. And, he talks about, trickle-down economics and everything else, but it's, sometimes these things don't work. And we have to understand that it's our responsibility to help the poor. It's our responsibility to serve the poor and to use our gifts and that we have to serve others. And so some cultural challenges that we are up against. So he kind of shifts over to, he's a realist. He's like, okay, this is where we live. This is the culture around us. This is what we have to figure out a way. And he doesn't give the answers. He says, these are the challenges we face. Now let's talk about how we can find some answers to these challenges. Relativism is one. He said, we should recognize how in a culture where each person wants to be bearer of his or her own subjective truth, it becomes difficult for citizens to devise a common plan which transcends individual gain and personal ambitions. As soon as we try to grasp at that fruit, I can decide what's right and wrong. I can decide what's true and not true. That relativism is just plaguing, especially our culture. There's no such thing as right and wrong. That's back to the story of Adam and Eve. You can decide for yourself what is good and what is evil. No, you can't. There is an objective truth. And once that objective truth is removed from the culture, once God is removed from the culture, then we have no common ground. We have no way of deciding, and we have no star to follow. We have nothing to guide us, and everything becomes relative to what you believe. That might be wrong for you, but it's not wrong for me. And that's the culture we live in. And so how do we face that culture? And how do we change that culture and help them to understand the danger of moral relativism? The concept really just crashes in on itself. If there's no such thing as right and wrong, then how can relativism be true? Because relativism says there's no such thing as right and wrong, and it's making a statement of truth by saying that. Well, it just crashes in on itself. And it leads not to happiness. It leads to a very depressing life. That there is no God, there is no truth. And we are just whatever we decide we want things to be. It doesn't pan out. It hasn't brought me happiness. Globalization, he talks about being cogs in a wheel and how people were made to be loved and things were made to be used. And sometimes we just try to use people for our own good, and if they're of no use to us, then we discard them. They become one of those forgotten, excluded people. And it's a whole culture of doing and having instead of becoming. And I talk about my patients in the nursing homes and how a lot of them, they're depressed because they've lost everything. They don't have any possessions. They lost their possessions. They lost their spouse. They lost their independence. They lost the ability to take care of themselves, and they've been tossed aside by a culture that says they're not worth anything because they can't really do anything and they don't really have anything. And they forgot that it's not about what we do and what we have, it's about who we become. And that they're made in the image and likeness of God, and that they can still become saints. We all have the ability to become saints, just regardless of what we do and what we have. And people were made to be loved, never to be used as an ends for something. As soon as we see people as something to be used, then we can toss them aside when they're not needed anymore. Mass media. He talks about the dangers of this. The negative aspects of the media and entertainment industries are threatening traditional values, and particularly the sacredness of marriage and the stability of the family. The family unit is the foundation of every society. Culture needs the family. Culture needs a mother and a father raising children, raising them up in the faith, teaching them the faith, teaching them virtue, teaching them discipline. And that's what makes a society run. You remove that and you destroy the culture. You think of the enemy. If you were the enemy, what would you attack? You would attack the family. And he's saying there's these negative aspects of the media that are breaking down the family and threatening traditional values. And the sacredness of marriage. He goes on to say, there's this growing deterioration of ethics, a weakening of a sense of personal and collective sin, and a steady increase in that relativism. These have led to a general sense of disorientation, especially in the periods of adolescence and young adulthood, which are so vulnerable to change. We know our young people are soaked in this culture. They're soaked in a culture that, again, we've lost the sense of right and wrong. We've lost the sense of sin. And in a relativist culture, if there's no such thing as right or wrong, then anything goes. And you can see the dangers. And these young people, as they're being formed in that, a lot of the education systems, they're not based on virtue anymore. A lot of times it's based on individualism. How can I make it for me? How can I support me? How can I, it's all about me. And we've lost that idea of virtue. We've lost that idea of service. And there's a huge danger of that, especially when these children are being formed. More on secularization. He says, for our country, as the bishops of the United States have rightly pointed out, while the Church insists on the existence of objective moral norms which are valid for everyone, there are those in our culture who portray this teaching as unjust, that is, as opposed to basic human rights. Such claims usually follow from a form of moral relativism that is joined to a belief in the absolute rights of individuals. In this view, the Church is perceived as promoting a particular prejudice and as interfering with individual freedom. And so we have to understand how the world views our church sometimes. And in a world that doesn't believe in right and wrong, this is seen as an injustice to them, that the church is imposing a prejudice on them, interfering with their freedom to do whatever they want to do. By calling something good or evil, the church, the world is angry at the Catholic Church. And so we have to understand that. We have to understand their perception, and so that we can counter that perception, we can explain. And again, he's talking about how can we explain to people. This next quote, I think, really sums it up. He says, again and again, the Church has acted as a mediator in finding solutions to problems affecting peace, social harmony, the land, the defense of life, human and civil rights, and so forth. And how much good has been done by Catholic schools and universities around the world. So the world can at least recognize the great contributions the Catholic Church has contributed in social justice. But then, yet, we find it difficult to make people see that when we raise other questions less palatable to public opinion, we are doing so out of fidelity to precisely the same convictions about human dignity and the common good. And so, how do we help people realize that the Church promotes the dignity of every human life? That's why we help the poor. That's why we serve the poor. That's also the very same reasons why the Church teaches what she does on her moral teachings that so many people reject and so many people just toss aside as being mean and prejudiced and bigoted. If we can't help people realize that the Church loves every human being, and every human being is created equal in dignity and respect and deserves to be loved and cherished, and that's why she teaches what she does. If we can't start there, it's really hard to have a conversation with somebody. If they just believe the Church is trying to be mean and bigoted and unequal in regards to moral norms, especially in regards to marriage and sexuality and those kind of things that the culture just doesn't understand at all. First we have to help them understand. Look, we have a common ground. We should want to love everybody. Now how do we do that? And this is why the Church teaches what she does. And so again, he's not giving answers here. He's just giving us the reality that we have so that we can work together to find ways to communicate this in a way that the culture can understand, in a way that's attractive to the culture, that doesn't push them away or judge them, but explains the truth in an attractive way. Talks about the crisis of the family. Again, we just talked about this. The family is the fundamental cell of society. It is a place where parents pass on the faith to their children. Marriage now tends to be viewed as a form of mere emotional satisfaction that can be constructed in any way or modified at will. But the indispensable contribution of marriage to society transcends the feelings and momentary needs of the couple. Marriage is not just about finding your ultimate fulfillment in another person or having warm, fuzzy feelings. Marriage is about helping get other people to heaven, raising families, raising children, helping get them to heaven. The goal of marriage is to get each other to heaven. The goal of every human relationship is to get each other to heaven. And love is not just a feeling, but a choice, an act of the will, the ability to choose to do what is best for your beloved. And how important is the family? How important it is to reclaim that family as the building block of society, for parents to teach their children the faith, to raise them in virtue. The culture depends on that. It depends on that. He talks about cities and urban places, and he talks about how the unified and complete sense of human life that the gospel proposes is the best remedy for the ills of the cities. And so there's a lot of crises in cities. And the analogy he gives is like a lot of times we build things to kind of keep people out. We have bars and windows and we're trying to keep people out. Where really it should be about the gospel of joy and welcoming people in. And there's so much great good that can be done in cities. We have to find a way to remedy that and that kind of situation. So this is what I was talking about before. This whole building a culture of encounter. I think this really kind of sums up this whole part of the chapter that he's talking about, is finding a way to encounter the poor, the excluded, in our own families. This quote I love: be very close to your children. They need you, your presence, to be there, your love. They need your presence. And again, this is an examination of conscience for me. When you come home, is it more like an army general, like just trying to get them to do things? Pick up your toys, brush your teeth, get your jammies on, and get in bed. I'm there with them, but basically just giving them orders. He's talking about a presence, like to be with them, to experience them, to become free from a culture so enslaved with efficiency. I gotta get this done. I gotta get this done. I gotta get this done. And my life is plagued with this. I got so many things I have to get done. And if we're so consumed by constantly getting things done, how can you just experience people? How can you just stop and actually encounter them? He talks about social media and gadgets and devices. Most of us encounter screens a lot more than we encounter people. I was sitting in the airport a couple weeks ago, just sitting in a little terminal there, getting ready for the plane to come. Just look around. Every single person looking at their gadget. Every single one of them. You get on the plane, there's one guy who was scared. He had his foot up. I didn't know he had earphones in. He's playing Angry Birds or something. And all of a sudden he just starts yelling and talking. I'm like, what's he doing? He got off the plane, and I realized he had headphones in, but it was kind of scary. He just, talking to himself, talking to his computer screen. And he said, when you communicate primarily by texting and email and computer screens, you remove yourself from the person. There's no encounter there. And you can just put them on hold. You don't have to respond to the text. You don't have to respond to the email. You can respond if you want to, or you can just say, I didn't get your text, or I didn't get your email, or whatever. It's easy to ignore people through a screen. It's hard to ignore people when you're right there and you encounter them, and you shake their hand, and you ask them their name, and you have a conversation with them. That's what he's talking about with this culture of encounter. We were in Orlando, we were at the hotel, and they had this thing there for timeshares. I know about this because this is what we did for our honeymoon. I was a little tight on money, and I took this little timeshare. I had no idea it was going to be this pressure sales thing where they want you to buy this timeshare. But they're offering these free 3 nights or whatever, and you know what a timeshare is. And so he's asking us at the hotel, do you guys have any free time while you're here? You can go check out this resort or whatever. And my aunt was with us, and she's like, well, we have 4 small kids or whatever. Oh, well, there's a place for the kids. And they will just love it. They'll just love it. They have all kind of things in there. They have iPads and iPods and gadgets and everything else. And my aunt was like, well, they're pretty little still, and they get attached to their mommy a lot, and they want their mommy around all the time. And you know what the guy said? With a straight face, he just said, oh, we don't need mommies anymore. Those those gadgets, they'll entertain them for hours. They don't even know mommy's gone. They don't need mommy. And he was being serious. It's like, we don't need mommies anymore. These kids, they're so entertained, they'll be gone for, they won't even want you to come back. They got so many toys and gadgets and everything else, they don't need their mom. And that's what we've come to. We don't need parents, we don't need moms, we don't need dads. We got gadgets, and we got toys, and we got electronic devices and everything else. He wants a culture of encounter. We actually encounter a person, experience a person. Be close to your children. Be in their presence, not just there physically, but actually be there in their presence. And then the second part of the chapter, he talks about these temptations we have as pastoral workers, and there's 5 basically ones that he talks about, temptations that we face when the people who work in the church. And again, when we talk about a crisis of commitment, we've got to remember the statistics from Dynamic Catholic, that 7% of Catholics do 80% of the time, talent, and treasure in any given parish. There's an 80-20 rule in business. It's not even that. It's 7 to 80. 7% of Catholics do everything. And so we have a crisis of people committing to do anything. And the people that do work for the church, the people that are here, these are the temptations that he's talking about. And he's very humble. He says, there's a lot of people out there that inspired me and helped me from my own selfishness. The Pope's calling himself selfish in the way he ministers to other people. And he's talking about these temptations that we all face. Number 1, loss of mission. And everything's about the mission. We start to see our ministry as an appendage, something else we have to do in our life. It's no longer a zeal of spreading the joy of the gospel. It's no longer a mission of getting people to heaven. It's just a job. We show up and we go to put in our hours, and it gets to be, you lose the zeal when you do that. It just becomes a job to you, and it becomes an annoying thing to do. And sometimes this can lead to doing the job poorly. And if we do the job poorly, sometimes it's better if you just don't do it at all. If you're going to teach kids class, and you're just going to go through motions, and it's going to be boring to you, it's going to be boring to them. And you're not only not really teaching them, you're just basically giving them the perception that Catholicism is boring. There's a danger in that. You can convince people to come to an event, and then you have the event, and they're like, why did you drag me here? You just did more harm than good. And that's what happens when you start going through motions and forget your mission. And so that's a temptation that turns into a business and not just a ministry anymore. Selfishness and spiritual sloth. Many lay people fear that they may be asked to undertake some apostolic work, and they seek to avoid any responsibility that may be taken away from their free time. For example, it has become very difficult today to find trained parish catechists willing to persevere in this work for some years. Something similar is also happening with priests who are obsessed with protecting their free time. And he's very blunt about everybody that we guard our time. It's this individualism. What's in it for me? What am I going to get out of this? And we're afraid to commit. This crisis of commitment. I don't want to do that because God's going to take away my free time, and I need my free time. And it becomes a job again, And when it's a job, then there's no passion, there's no zeal. And it's just another annoying thing that we have to do in our life. My job is not father. It's not a job. It's a vocation. And I can't just say to my kid, you know what? I work from 9 to 5. If you have a problem, you can come to me. Otherwise, I'm off duty. Don't come to me with your problems after 5 o'clock p.m. And that's how we see our ministry and our mission. It's not your job, it's your vocation. It's who we are. And everything revolves around that. Sloth, he goes a lot more into sloth, which again, is going through the motions. We do a lot as Catholics, and the dangers of just going through motions. And he talks about some of the reasons we do that. 4 fears in particular. Fear of disagreement. We don't want any conflict, so we're just going to go with the flow and just accept whatever the reality is and keep doing the same thing over and over, even though it doesn't work, because we don't want to fight, and we don't want to have conflict or have a conversation. Pope Francis is pretty good at challenging people to raise the conversation. We got to talk about these things. It doesn't have to be something we fight about. We have to be able to understand that people might not agree with us, But those things all have to be raised. We all have to talk about. We have to be willing to be able to disagree. Fear of failure. You know, I struggle with this. I don't do that. I might fail. It might not work out. You can't have a fear of failure. You got to trust God. Fear of criticism. People might not like that. They might criticize me for trying to do that, and so we just don't do anything. Fear of the cross. We're afraid to suffer. Jesus said, if you follow me, you have to be willing to pick up your cross. And so these are some of the fears that he believes causes this going through motions, this spiritual sloth of just getting by and trying to survive and business as usual kind of attitude. Pessimism. This is my favorite. This is, because it hits me so hard with pessimism. One of the more serious temptations which stifles boldness and zeal is defeatism, which turns us into querulous and disillusioned pessimists. Sourpusses, he calls us. It's a pope. Nobody can go off to battle unless he is fully convinced of victory beforehand. If we start without confidence, we have already lost half the battle, and we bury our talents. We bury our talents. You gotta believe in the gospel. You gotta believe in the power of God. This quote, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness." God's not afraid of our weakness. We can't be afraid to try because we might fail. We can't go in with this attitude of, woe is me and nothing I do works, which I do all the time. Nobody comes, nobody cares. These kids don't really want to be here, they don't care. And I get so stuck in pessimism all the time. Laying awake at night, it becomes more about my ministry, or what am I doing, what am I succeeding. Mother Teresa said, don't worry about numbers. She said, worry about treating the people around you. And start with the person, one person at a time, and start with the person closest to you. That's it. Just encounter that person. We can't be pessimists. We have to have confidence in our mission. Spiritual worldliness, which hides behind the appearance of piety and even love for the church, consists in seeking not the Lord's glory, but human glory and personal well-being. Constantly have to ask myself, am I more worried about the work of the Lord or the Lord of the work? Is it really about God's work, or is it really about my work? Is it really about what I want to accomplish? And there's so many great things to love in Catholicism. Sometimes we cling to the things we love as if that's all that matters. We forget it's about ministering to other people and helping other people get to heaven. And that's when he talks about spiritual worldliness, success, and numbers. And I've really discovered as speaking around, different places, the places where people are going to. I love speaking to the choir. When people love your message and they love you and they come up and they buy all your stuff and it's great. But the places where you actually need to be, like in the schools where they don't even want to be there. Last couple weeks ago I got to speak in a prison, which was just a wonderful, wonderful experience speaking to these guys. The one guy had 7 deadly sins tattooed on his arm, which I was going to talk about. And these were very nice. They were just very genuinely interested. But you don't get paid a dime for going there. But that's where you got to go. And if it's all about worldly success, then you're probably not going to be able to spread the joy of the gospel where it needs to be spread. If it's all about, I'll give you this if you give me that, then you're living in the world and you're not going to be able to minister to people that need to be ministered to. Your reward is in heaven, not here. And then worrying among ourselves. We are all in the same boat and headed to the same port. Let us ask for the grace to rejoice in the gifts of each which belong to all. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. We can't be fighting amongst ourselves all the time. We are one church, and we're in this together. And we all have gifts. We can all use those gifts for the glory of God if we work together. It's not about my parish versus your parish, or this or that, or my building and this building. We're one church with the goal of getting people to heaven. Remember the analogy of the boat? We're all on the same boat, going to the same place. It's not about the boat. It's about heaven. The boat gets us to heaven. We can't just cling to the things on the boat that we like and ignore everybody else. The purpose of the boat is to get people to heaven. We've got to remember our mission, and that's what it's about. And I love this destroying evil with good. I read this story of this lady in South Africa. Nelson Mandela, after he was released from prison, became the president of South Africa. And he designated Archbishop Desmond Tutu to help him with this project where he was tired. There's a lot of racism, a lot of bad things going on in that country. And he was tired of everybody just revenge, revenge, revenge. And he made this law, this rule, which seemed, I don't even know all the details, it seems really injustice, but it was about criminals. If they would profess their sin, their crime, to the person that they did the crime against and said they were sorry, they could be released. And there was this one story of this woman who was in the courtroom, and this police officer, several years back, had abducted her 17-year-old son and murdered him and burned him to destroy all the evidence and just burned him to ashes. And several years later, broke in, did the same thing to her husband. While she watched, she put him on, this big thing of fire, set him ablaze right in front of her. And this man is confessing his sins, his crime, to the woman that he had the crime against. And they looked at her, this old lady, and they said, "What would you like to do with him?" And she said, "Well, first I would like him to go and clean the ashes of my husband and my son so I can give them a proper burial." And the man just kind of looked down and nodded his head. And then she said, "And then I want him to know that he took away everyone, my whole family, everyone that I love. And I have so much love still to give. And so I want him to come to my house twice a month so that I can be a mother to him. And I can embrace him so that he understands that I forgive him and that God forgives him." And the whole courtroom just started singing Amazing Grace. And the guy passed out. And instead of revenge, 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 she treats evil with love. And you see the power of that. You see the power of spreading the joy of the gospel by changing it up a little bit, by changing it and just throwing the guy a curveball and not reacting in the way the world says you should react. And so that's what I think a good example of overcoming evil with good. And then he goes into the role of the laity. He talks about all the different things and all the different people. He talks about women. Again, things we have to, he talks about the reservation of the priesthood to males as a sign of Christ, the spouse who gives himself in the Eucharist, is not a question open to discussion. This isn't something that can change. But he says it can prove especially divisive if sacramental power is too closely identified with power in general. It must be remembered that when we speak of sacramental power, we are in the realm of function, not that of dignity or holiness. And so he's saying this is an issue causing division because people don't understand why the church teaches what she does. And we have to explain these things in ways that people can understand that it's not about power, that men are more superior or whatever. It's about what the church teaches in regards to that image of the sign of Christ and the spouse. And we all have roles to play. And no role is more important than another role. And how we have to find ways to help the laity to fill that potential that they have in those roles that they've been given in their realm. So, again, sometimes he goes on and talks about the youth and how he got to young people often fail to find responses to their concerns, needs, problems, and hurts in the usual structures. As adults, we find it hard to listen patiently to them, to appreciate the concerns and demands, and to speak to them in a language they can understand. So these are problems we have to address. How can we explain these things in language they understand? And how can we address the concerns and listen to them? Listen to the problems and concerns that they have. Same thing with the elderly. The elderly bring with them the memory and the wisdom of experience, which warns us not to foolishly repeat our past mistakes. So he wants us all to play roles. He wants to hear from everyone. And sometimes we just push people's opinions aside. When I was in Florida, it was so nice out. I went for a little run, and I went past this house, and this lady was sitting on the step, smoking her cigarette. And she said, if you run on your toes, it's not going to hurt your knees so much. At first I was like, you're telling me what to do? I ran track for 10 years and all this stuff, and she was right. You know? And it's something I forgot about, and she's right. And sometimes it's just like pushing her opinion aside because you feel like, you know, who are you to tell me? You know? But we have to listen, because there's a lot of wisdom in a lot of different people, and we need to work together to find answers for our church. So this challenge, this sums it up right here. Challenges exist to be overcome. Let us be realist, but without losing our joy, our boldness, and our hope-filled commitment. Let us not allow ourselves to be robbed of missionary vigor. And so that's that challenging chapter of here's the problems we're up against. We can't let them drag us down. We have to find solutions to those problems. All right, so just a few minutes, if you want to take a few minutes to discuss some of these things, here's a couple of the questions I thought would be relevant for us. Number one, how much do you allow fear of more work, fear of failure, or fear of conflict keep you from trying new ideas and giving the best of yourself to the church's mission? And number two, how does the same dynamic affect your relationship with your family members or your friends? All right, so how do those fears affect your life, affect your ability to serve the church, and also affect your ability to, you know, minister your relationships in your own family with your own friends? So just a few minutes at your tables if you kind of want to discuss those questions, and then we'll wrap it up.